Lachlan, great to have you here.
Love to be here.
So, a democratic society is one in which the citizens control the government. So, in Greek, we have demos, is the people, and kratos means to rule. So, essentially, the people rule. And it relies on the participation of citizens in order to work properly. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what people mean by democracy. I think the last point you stressed is really particularly important as well, in that there's many things you might think democracy involves and many things you might want it to do. But ultimately, I think most of us would think the fundamental purpose of democracy is to realize a system wherein leaders have incentives to protect and promote the interests of everyone on an equal basis, irrespective of social class, gender, race, that sort of thing. Yeah. And of course, the history of politics is that most non-democratic systems haven't done that. They create incentives for leaders to favour the interests of other powerful people in their society whose support they need to retain to keep their own position. Democracies, of course, the genius of democracy is that you tie the fortunes of elected officials to their perception in the public via the institution of the ballot box. And so when democracies work properly, you should expect them to be much more responsive to the interests of citizens than alternative systems of government. But they're only going to do that to the extent that you have wide or ideally kind of universal participation in politics. And to the extent that you have democratic systems wherein participation's lackluster only among sort of certain subsets of the population, I think we shouldn't be surprised in those cases that democracies tend not to work so well.
Technically, the government should be representative of the people. But if you put it to the bus stop test, so if we were to go out here to the closest bus stop and ask people, do you feel like you are in control of the government as a person, as a voter, let's say, people might laugh at you. And in some suburbs, they may actually feel quite angry about it and you might be laughed at. Do you think that this is just the Australian way? Do you feel that Australians might be sort of rebellions against authority, or is there a deeper sense of disempowerment that they might feel?
So I definitely think Australians are rebels against authority. It's one of the great things about being here.
Yeah.
I would say two serious things, though. The first is that I think our hypothetical person at the bus stop would be exactly right to reject the idea that they, or even they and all their mates together, are doing anything like ruling the country. I think what democracies are really good at doing, at least when they work properly, is securing leaders that have interests in a very imperfect system in promoting large groups of people, say, social classes, for example. But we shouldn't take from that the idea that any individual person is exercising anything like personal control over the laws they're subject to.
So the bus stop person isn't really in control of the government. It's the bus stop person plus that electorate.
Yeah, the bus stop person is kind of sharing in a system of collective control. And that's enormously valuable. We shouldn't downplay that, but I think we shouldn't be kind of overly romantic about what democracy can deliver either.
Yeah.
The second thing, though, I would say is that I do, in fact, think there is some evidence to think that it really is true that there is rising dissatisfaction and disempowerment in democracies. I think Australia is insulated from that more than a lot of other countries, but it remains the case that there is, in fact, evidence from, say, the Australian Electoral Study. That's the leading kind of empirical measure of democratic sentiment in Australia. In 2007 was the peak of satisfaction with Australian democracy at about 85%. And since that time, it's fallen to below 60. A pretty steady decline it is as well. Same time, witnessed the kind of the increasing popularity of the Greens, sort of a rolling selection of different parties on the right in Australian politics, the success of the Teals in the last election. All of those things, I think, point to, at the very least, dissatisfaction with the major political parties in Australia as well. And they're critical democratic institutions in themselves. They might not be formal arms of government. We certainly need them if we want government to work properly. And I do think that sentiment is something, to say the least, to keep an eye on, in that democratic systems ultimately run on the agreement of the citizenry with the democratic ideal. And so long-term dissatisfaction with that process can be pretty corrosive, I think, if we're not careful about the way the system's running.
Yeah, and that will show up at election time.
Yeah. People
will make their vote. So how about compulsory voting? So as we know, voting is compulsory in Australia, and that locks in a higher participation rate than many countries. And of course, the punishment is a small fine. But if we were to look at the turnout of voters and the history of turnout of voters at federal elections, It started with about 55% in 1901, way back then, and it peaked with about 96% in the middle of World War II in 1943. But now we're down again towards the bottom with about 90% in this year's election. So we're seeing a trend of growth and now decline. There are an estimated 116,000 people around Australia who are homeless tonight. And according to a recent study by researchers at the Universities of South Australia, Adelaide and Flinders, turnout by homeless citizens to elections is about 10 to 67%. Now that's a big gap. It's hard to measure. Despite apparently their political interests are often higher than the average voter. And of course, children can't vote, and yet their education and their housing and schooling funding all relies on what happens at the ballot box. And on top of that, it's likely that a lot of people who are voting are uninformed or disinterested and so forth. So there's a question about whether they're voting well. They may vote out of habit, out of family habits and so forth. So if we're missing significant parts of the population who are interested, and including significant parts of the population who are disinterested, can we still say that compulsory voting is working? And is it the best thing that we can do democratically?
I think I and other people who are fans of compulsory voting tend to construe this in terms of a collective action problem.
Okay.
So we've already talked a little bit about the fact that every voter is surely aware when they turn up to a primary school or wherever it is that they're just not going to be in a position to determine the outcome. Their vote will count in the process of working out what the final result is going to be, but it's never going to be the case that the outcome is going to depend on how you choose to exercise your vote. If that's right, if my vote is just not going to make a difference in that way anyway, what's the point of voting in the first place? And if enough people from a discrete class of the citizenry start to think in that way, then the concern is that you can have a large fraction of that group in question, say the poor, as is in fact true in many democracies, that just elect not to participate. And that in turn, you should expect to be very bad for the interests of that group, because of course politicians, and there's very good empirical support for this, are perfectly aware of the fact that some groups participate in greater numbers than others, and they are more responsive to the interests of groups that participate more. And so even though it might, in a sense, it's kind of rational for people to drop out of participating, the consequences for the collective interests of those groups can be very bad. So if the question is, does compulsory voting work? I think with respect to its fundamental purpose of ensuring that by and large, you don't have large groups of citizens that just radically under-participate in elections, compulsory voting in Australia is enormously successful. With that said, it's definitely not any kind of democratic panacea. So there are certainly groups where people under-participate, compulsory voting notwithstanding. It's the case that under Australian law, as is reasonable, it's only registered voters that can be compelled to participate, and there's a very well-recognised problem of under-registration among voters, particularly among younger voters, and Indigenous citizens as well. Also, you can't guarantee that when people cast a ballot, particularly if they're compelled to do so, they're going to vote formally. And there is, rather regrettably, if you look at Australian electorates where there's large proportions of disadvantaged people tend to have the highest rates of informal balloting as well. Voting in a way, marking your ballot paper in a way where it's not going to count as an effective vote.
Like graffitiing.
So graffitiing, writing an offensive slogan or whatever it might be.
Yes,
Fine
Australian to the person who
fine Australian traditions, of course.
Of course.
And compulsory voting can't by itself anyway, is not going to do anything to mitigate that problem.
Now, what about the right to vote? So in some parts of the world, there are groups of citizens wanting to lower the age of voting. What do you think about that? Should we allow children to vote in Australian elections? And if so, sort of what age? Tell me more about the potential for children to vote.
Yeah, so I'm amongst the people that's very in favour of enfranchising children. And I think we approach this issue in a really strange way. Maybe because the idea of enfranchising children is quite an unpopular one. among the public at large. I haven't looked at the research for a while, but from memory, it's about 70 to 80% of people are opposed to lowering the voting age.
Yeah.
At least in Australia a few years ago. Maybe that's different now. But the way that we seem to go is we seem to take, here's our sort of status quo institution where, everyone 18 and over, or at least every citizen 18 and over is eligible to vote, and in Australia ought to vote, and everyone below that should not. And then we have this discussion by asking if there's any reason for departing from a system that excludes a large group of citizens. But when you think about all the other rights that we give people, we don't approach it in that way. We tend to think instead, well, there's a presumption in favour of distributing rights equally, and then we look for some special justification from departing from that presumption. And I think that's the way we should think about the franchise as well. I think if we're going to make access to a system of popular representation and voting available to the citizenry at large, the presumption should be that everyone is included, and then the onus is on the state, if you like, to show us why there should be exclusion in the case of children.
Yeah.
And I guess the main point that I'd make is that the arguments to me don't seem really that promising as to why, I'm not in favour of enfranchising tiny infants, of course, but say children from the age of 12 or so. Yeah. For example, some people say, well, children tend to know less about politics than adults. To which you'd be tempted to say one thing. Well, if you look at the research about political knowledge, you can pretty easily frighten yourself about the fact that there's plenty of adults whose political knowledge is pretty poor as well.
If you ask any voter, some voters, about the policies behind the people they just voted for, I mean, it's really hard to rattle that off, and I don't know how many people are doing it by habit.
If you go back to the issue we're talking about and say, well, look, children shouldn't be permitted to vote because they don't know enough, well, we're certainly not prepared to endorse that in the case of adults. And it doesn't seem to me that we're allowed to do it in the case of children merely because they're children. There has to be something to be said there.
Yes. So, Lachlan, you work within the intersection of political science and political philosophy, which is a fascinating space. How do these two fields overlap in your research and writing about democracy? How do they inform each other?
Yeah, so I'm trained as a philosopher, but I think these days I identify more as a kind of miscellaneous interdisciplinary scholar, in the sense that what I'm interested in the major social institutions, elections in particular, but other ones too, and I'm interested in how they do work and how they ought to work as well. So classic kind of philosophical questions around them. But I also think that if you want to do anything other than say things that are really abstract, if you want to try and involve yourself in policy discussions, or if you want to try and say something about the real world, it's just not, in my opinion, it's just not acceptable to do that kind of work without engaging with the social science that tells us, or tries to tell us anyway, how those institutions work. Funnily enough, I think actually it's become a lot more popular, a lot more acceptable in academic circles to do interdisciplinary work of this kind. Yes. And I think that's in part been driven by really developments in undergraduate teaching in a way, in that over the last 15 or 20 years, philosophy, politics and economics programs and other similar sorts of interdisciplinary sort of endeavours for students have become a lot more popular. And that's created, in effect, it's created a kind of a demand for people who are kind of conversant across different fields to at least some degree. Yeah. And this is very kind of curious in that, it's an interesting case of the demands of undergraduate teaching leading the kind of, at least pushing more into the research space as well, which is quite unusual, I think.
It's lovely.
It's something to welcome, I think.
Yeah.
And none of this is to say that I don't think sort of really pure abstract philosophical work, some of which I've also done, is is invaluable. I really think it is. It's just that there is a real place for philosophical work or work in other fields that tries to borrow insights from other successful academic enterprises. And I think we should welcome a world where there's more of that research going around.
Yes, it's issues driven and thematic rather than disciplinary, I suppose.
That's a nice way of putting it, I think.
We beg forgiveness to all the analytical philosophers.
I won't be allowed back into my department now.
That's right.